In 1891, a 14-year-old boy walked off his family's corn farm with $5 in his pocket and no intention of coming back. His name was Jesse Livermore. To everyone around him, he looked like an ordinary farm kid from Massachusetts, thin, quiet, already worn down by field work. But Jesse had one thing that set him apart. He processed numbers almost effortlessly. He could look at prices, compare movements, and spot repeating behavior that adults around him never noticed. He didn't just do arithmetic, he felt movement. The small shifts that other people ignored stood out to him like flashing signals. No one in his town understood what that meant. Decades later, the United States would enter the worst economic collapse in its history. Millions of people would lose jobs, homes, and savings. Banks would fail. That disaster would become known as the Great Depression. To most Americans, it felt like ruin. For Jesse, it became the moment that defined his legend. While the country was breaking, he would make a fortune so large that people called him the most dangerous speculator on Wall Street and one of the richest men alive. But in 1891, none of that existed yet. America was still mostly rural. Most people were born, worked, married, and were buried within a few miles of the same town. Life was about surviving physical labor, not chasing ambition. That was the future Jesse's father assumed for him. Wake up before sunrise, work the land, accept whatever the harvest and the market gave you, and repeat that until you die. Jesse hated that plan. He wasn't unwilling to work. He simply refused to accept that exhausting farm labor and slow poverty were his ceiling. He wanted a different life, even if he didn't yet know exactly what it looked like. His mother, Laura, quietly agreed. She saw what his father couldn't. Jesse wasn't just good in school. He had a mathematical mind that bordered on unnatural. He could track tiny changes in crop prices and remember them days later. He could do mental calculations instantly. His schoolmaster noticed too, and told Laura bluntly that keeping Jesse on the farm would waste his ability. The message was basically, this boy doesn't belong behind a plow. So Laura made a decision. One cold morning, after Jesse's father had gone off to a distant field, she pulled her son aside in the kitchen. She handed him $5, a huge sum for their family, and told him to leave. Go to Boston. Use your head, not your back. Don't come home to the farm. That moment launched everything that followed. She didn't know it, but she had just turned loose one of the most brilliant and ultimately self-destructive trading minds Wall Street would ever see. Jesse arrived in Boston with almost nothing but determination. The timing was interesting. The Industrial Revolution was transforming the United States from a farm economy into an industrial one. Factories, railroads, telegraph lines, and national finance were creating a new class of men who made money with information instead of muscle. For the first time, wealth seemed reachable without physical labor. Cities like Boston and New York were filling with brokers, bankers, and commodity traders who moved capital across the country at telegraph speed. A smart kid with nerve could, at least in theory, break into that world. But the stock market in the 1890s was still a private game. Regular people weren't invited. The average worker in the U.S. made about $400 a year. Meanwhile, industrial giants like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller operated on a completely different level, controlling steel, oil, railroads, and political influence. The market was their playground, not a place for ordinary teenagers. Yet, that is exactly where Jesse ended up. His first job was at a brokerage office. He worked as a board boy, which was the lowest rung in the market food chain, and also, for him, the perfect classroom. Prices of different railroad, mining, and industrial stocks came in over the ticker tape. Jesse's job was to copy those constantly changing quotes in chalk on a giant board at the front of the room, so clients could watch the market in real time. The room would fill with wealthy men in suits, cigar smoke hanging in the air, murmurs of rumor and strategy bouncing around as people tried to outguess each other. Most people in the office treated that job like basic clerical work. Jesse treated it like live training. He stood there for hours every day, copying numbers and watching how they changed. He saw that prices didn't jump randomly. He noticed that certain stocks tended to move in sequences. When one price shifted, another price often reacted soon after. He started building cause and effect maps in his head. Within a few months, he realized something that would shape his entire career. If you studied those movements closely enough, you could often predict where a stock would go next. He wasn't getting inside tips. He wasn't guessing. He was doing pattern recognition in real time, testing his ideas against what actually happened on the board. For someone his age, this was unheard of. By 16, he had saved enough to try trading for himself. He made his first real bet on Burlington stock and walked away with a profit. To Wall Street veterans, the win was small. To Jesse, it meant everything. It wasn't about the dollars, it was about proof. He had outguessed the adults. He was right, and the market confirmed it. That feeling became his fuel. Through the early 1900s, he treated trading like science. He tracked prices, rumors, political news, supply shortages, railroad delays, freight costs, and even weather reports. He taught himself how crowds behaved. He learned that greed and fear could move markets faster than logic. He built his whole identity around being the guy who could see the turn before everyone else. Winning trades weren't just income to him, they were a statement. I'm smarter than you. His rise took place alongside a shift in American power. In 1914, World War I erupted in Europe. President Woodrow Wilson kept the United States officially neutral at first. Neutral didn't mean disconnected. It meant profitable. The American factories began supplying rifles, ammunition, uniforms, food, and machinery to the countries that were fighting. European nations borrowed billions from American banks to pay for it. Money flowed into the U.S. at historic levels. The result was simple. Europe was being destroyed, and the United States was getting rich. That flow of money helped set up what we now call the Roaring Twenties, a period when America started acting like prosperity would last forever. Wall Street began replacing London as the center of global finance. The U.S. wasn't just a supplier anymore. It was becoming the creditor to the planet. By then, Jesse had already lived through several financial lifetimes. His trading record looked like a roller coaster. He would make huge wins, then suffer huge losses. He declared bankruptcy more than once and always clawed his way back. He took massive risks on market direction instead of playing it safe. Volatility didn't scare him, it excited him. He wasn't in love with stability. He was in love with the game. A famous early example came in 1906. After studying the situation in California, Jesse concluded that the San Francisco earthquake would send shockwaves through finance. Insurance companies would get hit. Railroads would be disrupted. Panic would ripple through certain stocks. He bet accordingly and made roughly $250,000 in one day. That was an enormous fortune for the time. Within 2 years, thanks to bad trades and bad partners, most of it was gone. Those crashes taught him two conflicting lessons. First, the market is bigger than any trader. You can be brilliant and still lose everything fast. Second, he believed he could always come back. Every recovery reinforced his belief that he was different, that he could read the tape better than anyone else. The risk wasn't just exciting, it was addictive. Around the same time, his personal life began to take shape. In 1917, as the U.S. finally entered World War I, Jesse met a 22-year-old Broadway dancer named Dorothy Went. He called her Dotsy. She was outgoing, social, and warm, and unlike Jesse, she wasn't obsessed with charts and numbers. She liked the man, not the myth. They married in 1918, just as the war was ending, and the United States was stepping into global financial leadership. By then, Jesse was already wealthy. He bought an extravagant estate and named it Livermore. The house wasn't just expensive, it was theatrical. Grand rooms, polished floors, servants, manicured grounds. A physical display of, I made it. It was supposed to stand for permanent money, permanent status, permanent love. It was his way of telling the world, and Dorothy, that this was forever. But while his personal life looked glamorous, something much bigger was happening across the country. During the war, the U.S. government had sold Liberty bonds to the public to fund military spending. Those campaigns did something subtle but revolutionary. They taught millions of ordinary Americans to think like investors. People who had never dealt with anything more sophisticated than a savings jar were suddenly buying government debt, collecting interest, and talking about yields. After the war ended, that habit didn't go away. It shifted into stocks. In other words, average people were now mentally prepared to speculate. Wall Street was no longer this mysterious temple that only the Rockefellers and Carnegies could enter. The public felt like it had a right to play. That cultural shift synced up with rapid advances in technology and lifestyle. Radio turned the country into a single conversation. Henry Ford's factories were pushing cars into middle-class driveways. Household appliances and consumer goods were sold on installment credit. Advertising exploded. Urban nightlife, jazz, celebrity gossip, and national brands made America feel modern and unstoppable. By the late 1920s, the message was everywhere. Prosperity is here to stay. Why not get rich? Of course, it wasn't actually permanent. Beneath the optimism, the country was quietly building one of the biggest speculative bubbles in financial history. The United States had become the world's lender. European nations owed American banks more than $10 billion, a staggering sum at the time. Wall Street money felt limitless. Easy credit poured into the stock market, and easy credit always tempts people into believing risk doesn't matter. This is where Jesse's story takes its sharpest turn. While most of America was celebrating, he started getting nervous. He didn't panic. He prepared. By the mid-1920s, Jesse had built something unheard of for an individual trader, a private intelligence network. He employed around 60 people, statisticians, commodity researchers, political contacts, and field observers. They sent him non-stop data on crop yields, freight traffic, foreign interest rates, factory output, labor unrest, and corporate earnings. He kept an open line to sources in London, Paris, and Berlin. There's a story that his monthly phone bill ran to $15,000, which would be around $200,000 in today's terms. That gives you a sense of how aggressively he gathered information. In short, he industrialized intuition. He turned trading into information warfare. While most investors were gambling off rumors, Jesse was getting early warnings from around the world. If wheat harvests in the Midwest looked weak, he knew. If a European bank tightened credit, he knew. If shipping slowed in a specific port, he knew. His goal was to be ahead of everyone, including the market itself. But that edge had a cost. Jesse was now working 18-hour days and basically living in his office. Dorothy was raising their 2 sons mostly alone at Livermore. She watched her husband disappear into a world of numbers. On top of the loneliness, Jesse was unfaithful. He had affairs constantly. Dorothy knew. She was humiliated, and she began to drink heavily, often to the point of blacking out by night. The marriage that had started with love and promise was decaying under pressure and resentment. At the exact same time, the rest of America was getting intoxicated with margin debt. By 1928, buying on margin had become a national obsession. Margin buying let you purchase stocks with borrowed money. With a small amount of cash and a loan, even a clerk or taxi driver could control a big position. Suddenly, everyone felt like an investor. Taxi drivers traded stock tips with riders. Barbers recommended can't-miss companies while cutting hair. A New York shoeshine boy named Pat Bologna became known for giving advice to bankers and executives while polishing their shoes, and people actually took him seriously. It went even further. There was a famous astrologer named Evangeline Adams who built a booming business predicting stock, moves using horoscopes and crystal balls. People lined up to pay for guidance. That's how wild the mood was. The country honestly believed the market was an endless money machine. Corporate leaders fed that fantasy. A General Motors executive publicly claimed that the United States had reached a permanent plateau of prosperity. Translation: the boom would never end. Jesse didn't buy it. His data was flashing danger. His network warned him that interest rates in London were rising, which signaled that foreign money was leaving U.S. markets. A well-known British financier named Clarence Hicktrey had been arrested for major fraud, shaking international credit confidence, and Jesse's own analysis showed that stock prices had drifted far beyond any logical relationship to company earnings. Prices weren't about value anymore. They were about pure speculation floating above reality. So, he moved. Quietly, he built huge short positions. Bets that the market would fall. That was an extremely lonely stance. Wall Street celebrities and mainstream newspapers were still cheerleading non-stop. Ordinary Americans were borrowing to buy more shares. Jesse was taking the opposite side and effectively betting against the entire country. Meanwhile, his marriage was falling apart. Dorothy had discovered his affairs. She felt betrayed and publicly embarrassed. She was drinking heavily and eventually began an affair of her own, reportedly with a young prohibition agent whose job was supposed to be enforcing alcohol laws. The once romantic Livermore estate turned into a tense, unhappy house. Their sons, Jesse Jr. and Paul, were eventually sent off to boarding school just to get them away from the constant conflict. Then the break finally came. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. That day, panic selling ripped through Wall Street. About 16.4 million shares traded in blind fear. The Dow Jones Industrial Average collapsed. People who had believed they were guaranteed to get rich were wiped out in hours. Radios and newspapers sounded apocalyptic. Banks were in trouble. Some traders killed themselves. Entire fortunes evaporated in a single trading session. Jesse's positions exploded in the other direction. His shorts paid off on a historic scale. He reportedly made about $66 million in one day and more than $100 million over the crash period. To understand what that meant at the time, in less than a week, he personally earned more than most major corporations made in an entire year. For a moment, he was one of the richest men in America, and maybe in the world. That night, he drove his Rolls-Royce back to Livermore. Inside, Dorothy and the boys were terrified. They had been listening to the news. They assumed Jesse had been ruined like everyone else. Instead, he told them the truth. They weren't broke. They were now outrageously wealthy. While the rest of the country was collapsing, the Livermores were protected. Dorothy couldn't process it. She had prepared to console a bankrupt husband. Instead, she was standing next to a man who had profited from the country's worst financial disaster. Beyond their gates, the United States was entering freefall. The crash was just the opening chapter of what became the Great Depression. By 1932, about 13 million Americans were unemployed, roughly 1 in 4 workers. Banks failed in waves. Families lined up for bread. People lost homes and moved into shanty towns. The cheerful confidence of the 1920s vanished and was replaced by anger and despair. That anger needed a target, and Jesse became one of them. He was suddenly portrayed as the villain who got rich while ordinary Americans lost everything. Death threats started arriving at his house. He had to hire armed bodyguards. The man who had just executed one of the most successful trades in Wall Street history also became one of the most hated people in the country. The winnings from 1929 didn't fix his private life either. Dorothy's drinking worsened. She started seeing that prohibition agent. In 1932, Jesse and Dorothy divorced. The split was ugly and very public. Newspapers covered it in detail. The most shocking part? Dorothy remarried almost immediately, reportedly within an hour of the divorce being finalized. She took their 2 sons west. Jesse was left alone in the enormous Livermore estate, surrounded by physical proof of his wealth and almost no one to share it with. And in the background, something even more painful was happening. His trading edge started to fade. After the crash, the U.S. government changed the rules. Under Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, regulators tried to rebuild trust in the financial system and prevent another meltdown. The Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, was created to police markets, require disclosure, and stop manipulation. Banks were forced to separate traditional deposit-taking from riskier investment operations under new laws like the Banking Act and what became known as Glass-Steagall. In other words, the wild, mostly unregulated marketplace that Jesse had mastered was being locked down. For men like Jesse, this was a different world. His style depended on reading crowd behavior in a mostly unregulated environment. He wasn't built to be a slow, conservative manager. He was built to strike fast in chaos. Now the chaos was being contained and supervised. He kept trying anyway. He attempted comeback after comeback, but his trades kept going wrong. By 1934, he had lost most of the fortune he made in 1929. He was deep in debt and facing bankruptcy for the 4th time. Then came another blow. In 1935, during a drunken argument in California, his ex-wife accidentally shot their eldest son, Jesse Jr. The boy survived, but for Jesse the incident was shattering. He already felt disconnected from his family. Now, even their safety felt out of his control. The last 5 years of his life were a slow slide. He remarried, this time to a woman named Nina. But the pattern repeated: obsession with markets, emotional distance, infidelity, disappointment. His trades failed. His debts grew. The man who had once looked invincible now seemed like a relic who could not adapt to the modern, regulated market he helped create. On Thanksgiving Day, November 28, 1940, Jesse Livermore walked into the Sherry Netherland Hotel in Manhattan. He ordered drinks, went into a men's room, and shot himself. Police found a note in his pocket addressed to Nina. It wasn't bragging or angry. It was exhausted. In it, he wrote that he was tired of fighting, that he felt like a failure. He repeated versions of the same line again and again. My life has been a failure. That is how the story ends. The runaway farm kid who turned pure pattern recognition into millions. The trader who made more money in 6 days than most companies made in a year. The man who outguessed entire markets. He died convinced he was worthless, and that's the lesson people usually skip. Jesse Livermore proved how far information, nerve, and timing can take you in finance. He also proved that money alone can't keep you stable, can't keep your family together, and can't save you from yourself. He conquered the market. He couldn't conquer his own habits. The price of total obsession was everything else that mattered. If you made it this far, drop a cash emoji in the comments so I know you watched to the end. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on for more long-form deep dives into the people who shaped global finance. And when you're done here, go watch the documentary on J.P. Morgan. It'll show you how financial power built modern America.